So we're going to deal with all of these trusts that have been booming in the United States at this point in the late 1800s. And the government quickly realizes they need to do something about controlling these trusts or breaking them up because they were monopolizing market shares. And the government didn't really consider that fair play. So one of the acts that they passed is the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. Now notice this happens way late in the 1800s. But this law is meant to do exactly what I just said, and that's break up these large trusts or monopolies so that they can't monopolize a large portion of the market share and eliminate competition, because that's what this country was founded on, was the idea of equal opportunity and competition. So the law is really, however, ineffective because there wasn't anybody in government who really had the guts to enforce it against these big magnates, but it also had a lot of loopholes in it, and companies really quickly figured out how they could get around the monopoly law. So we still have companies today doing that. Now, the South and industry. So in the South, they're still recovering from the Civil War because, you know, Sherman tore the place up. It was really ugly, and they're really trying to still get on their feet even late in the 1800s. But one of the men that's able to help the South out tremendously was a guy named James Buchanan Duke. Ugh, I can't even say the word properly. You guys know I'm a Carolina graduate. So James Buchanan Duke comes along, and he forms the American Tobacco Company, and this happens because of an invention that does cigarette rolling, and it rolls cigarettes automatically rather than by hand, so the tobacco industry is able to boom, and Duke takes advantage of this. And he gives a lot of his money, the social gospel, he gives a lot of his money to Trinity College, which then becomes renamed as, sad face, Duke University. I'm sure the Cameron crazies weren't around back then. So it is still, though, in the South, very rural, the conditions, and there is a desperate need for good transportation. And they had some rail lines, but not enough. And then there was discriminatory pricing on these rail lines. So if you were shipping from the north to the south, you paid a much lower rate than if you were shipping from the south to the north. So those prices were discriminatory, and the South really is going to pay the price on that one, literally. Now, women. Women enter the workforce in fairly large numbers at this point. It wasn't a huge percentage, but it was definitely more than we had seen before. And two inventions really allow the women to really enter the workforce because these inventions were things that women could do better than men because of the size of their fingers and their hands. This was tedious work, and it required agility and flexibility. So the typewriter and the telephone, plugging and unplugging all of those wires and typing on a typewriter, really was much better suited for a woman's hands than it was for a man's. Now, with women entering the workforce, they put off things that had always been taken for granted that young women would do. They delay marriage, and they delay having families. So women get married at an older age, and they don't have as many children as they used to because they weren't popping them out as quickly. This is very much a wage-earning society. People lived for their paychecks at this point. Whereas in the past, they didn't necessarily work for somebody else. They worked for themselves a lot of times. Now they're working for somebody else, and 2/3 of our population relied on a paycheck. Now, what does that mean? That means that if there's an economic depression in the country, 2/3 of the population is likely going to pay for that. They're going to be hit by it. So it really makes it very tedious economically for the country to function. Factories at this point are very large, and they're impersonal. People no longer worked for your neighbor. You no longer worked as an apprentice. You didn't have a familial bond with people. It was very impersonal at this point, faceless. A lot of machines in factories, which made it even more faceless. Now, in an effort to raise wages and to get workers' rights respected, a lot of unions get formed during this time. And they're formed because of the wages being down. Now, why are wages down? Well, they're down because the labor supply is high, supply and demand. If the labor supply is really, really high, bosses don't have to pay that much to get good workers in. If the labor supply is low, it's going to be a different story. So unions are going to try to remedy the situation, but the scabs and the thuds, they replace striking workers. So if you go out on strike, you can expect to be replaced by a scab or a thud. Now, this was a nickname given by unions to replacement workers. Union members were often beaten up. The company would hire people to come in and beat up labor unions, so that members of labor unions, so they wouldn't have to deal with them, and they would try and intimidate them, bully them from coming into the union. Federal judges didn't support unions, and if you went on strike, the judge would often pass a ruling saying you have to go back to work or you're going to lose your job. They brought in, a lot of companies brought in federal troops, the Army, to enforce working hours and so forth and make sure people stayed on the job. Or companies would also lock you out. If you threatened to go out on strike or you joined a union, the company would lock the doors and say, there's no work here today. You can't get paid. Okay, similar to what the NHL did this year to their players. Okay, they locked them out. So what unions were formed? One was called the National Labor Union that had about 600,000 members, and it became a conglomeration of various unions coming together, and that's what we're going to see a lot of. The Knights of Labor is another union in 1869. They were one big union, brought a lot of unions together, and they really campaigned hard for an 8-hour workday. The leader of the Knights of Labor was a guy named Terence Powderly, and they had about 750 members. Now, the Knights of Labor get into some trouble here in Haymarket Square in Chicago. There's a riot that breaks out between members of the union and the police. A bomb is thrown, and there are several people killed in this, and 8 people would be arrested. Now, the accusation was that those 8 people were all members of this union, and therefore they must have been anarchists, because how dare you be a member of a union? And these 8 anarchists they were tried, shammily, and they went to jail. 5 of them were put to death, and 3 of them spent a good portion of their lives in jail, but they were later pardoned. Kind of sounds like 5 people were put to death for no good reason. The American Federation of Labor is still around today. We call it the AFL, okay? That was started up by a man named Samuel Gompers, and they were a federation of national unions as well.